This girl was pushed off a ship, and in that same instant, a millionaire plunged into the deep sea to save her. But before they could relax, something shocking happened. Comment and subscribe to my channel to support my work. The biting wind of early evening carried the scent of salt air as Lily groped along the ground with her cane, her small fingers tightly clutching the only object that guided her through the world. She had learned to distinguish every sound, every texture, every subtle change in the air around her. At just 7 years old, the city streets were her home, even though she never truly felt at home anywhere. Her stomach ached, protesting another day without a decent meal. Her steps were hesitant, weary after hours of wandering in search of something to eat. The noise of cars and people hurrying home disoriented her, but she refused to stop. Stopping meant thinking, and thinking hurt, more than hunger. People passed her as if she were invisible. Some deliberately avoided her, others bumped into her without caring. Lily had grown accustomed to the indifference, but that didn't make it any easier. In her lonely nights, when the silence allowed her thoughts to wander, a single memory comforted her, a gentle voice singing a melody about stars and dreams. It was all she had of her past, a distant echo that soothed her in her most difficult moments. On this particular night, something different caught her attention. A tempting aroma of hot food mingled with the peculiar sounds coming from the direction of the docks. Normally, she avoided that area. The strong smell of fish and the constant noise of boats confused her. But hunger was stronger than fear. Following the promising aroma, Lily began to walk towards what appeared to be a large ship. Her sensitive hands detected the change in the flooring, from rough concrete to the wooden planks of the pier. The sound of water lapping against the structure created a rhythmic music that helped her maintain her balance. "Hey, kid! Hungry?" A male voice called out to her, making her stop. It was a deep voice, seemingly friendly, but something about it made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. "We've got hot food inside. You can come in and warm up." The promise of a hot dinner was too tempting to resist. Her feet led her towards the voice while her mind screamed in warning. The smell of food grew stronger with each step, now mixing with a different odor, something she couldn't identify. Before she could react, rough hands grabbed her arms brutally. Her cane slipped away, falling with a dull thud that echoed in her ears like a sentence. Panic overwhelmed her as she felt her body being lifted off the ground. "Shouldn't trust strangers, little blind girl." The same voice, now filled with malice, whispered close to her ear. The hot, unpleasant breath made her stomach churn. Everything happened very quickly. A violent shove, the terrible sensation of emptiness beneath her feet, the icy wind cutting through her skin. Lily was falling, without her cane, without reference, without anything to hold on to. The world, already dark for her, seemed even emptier at that moment. The sound of the waves grew louder, more menacing. She couldn't even scream. Years on, the streets had taught her that screams rarely brought help. So she just waited. Her small body surrendered to the fate that awaited her in the icy waters below. But something unexpected happened. A different shout cut through the air, followed by the sound of another body tearing through the wind in her direction. Strong arms enveloped her in mid-fall, a protective embrace she had never experienced before. The impact with the water was violent. The cold penetrated her bones like thousands of needles. Salt water flooded her nose, her mouth, making her lungs burn. The arms holding her struggled against the current, but she could feel them trembling too. Lily didn't fight. She saw no reason to. In her short life, she had learned that fighting didn't always mean surviving. Sometimes surviving was simply accepting. So she surrendered. Her small and fragile body completely yielded to the waters that seemed to want to swallow her. The shouts and movement above them seemed distant, as if they belonged to another world. A world she never really was a part of. The cold began to numb her senses, and that old lullaby echoed in her mind, clearer than ever. When they were finally pulled out of the water, Lily was semi-conscious. Agitated voices mingled with the sound of her own labored breathing. Someone wrapped her in something dry and warm, but the cold seemed to have settled in her soul. Who did this? The voice of the man who saved her sounded furious, but no one answered. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with secrets she didn't yet understand. Someone must have seen something. But Lily knew no one would speak up. The streets had taught her that people prefer to pretend they don't see other people's pain. It was easier that way, less complicated, less painful. Draven watched the girl huddled in the back seat of his Cadillac, shivering despite the heater being on full blast. The soaked suit clung to his body, but he barely felt the discomfort. His mind was focused on understanding what had just happened. Why had he jumped? He who had always calculated every step of his life, who had built an empire based on cold, rational decisions, had thrown himself into the sea to save a blind street urchin. The driver occasionally cast worried glances in the rearview mirror, but knew better than to ask questions. Years of working for Draven had taught him that silence was golden, especially when his boss had that look on his face, a mixture of contained rage and confusion he had never seen before. "Where to, Mr. Sterling?" the driver finally asked when they stopped at a red light. "To my place," Draven replied without hesitation, surprising even himself with the decision. His mansion was his sanctuary, a place where he rarely allowed strangers. But something about this kid unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. Lily remained quiet, her small hands gripping the blanket that someone had placed over her shoulders. Every turn of the car made her squeeze her fingers tighter into the soft fabric, as if it were her only anchor to reality. The smell of leather, seats, and expensive cologne was foreign to her, so different from the smells of the streets she was used to. "What's your name?" Draven tried, his voice rougher than he intended. Silence. "Do you have family? Anyone we can contact?" More silence. Draven sighed, running a hand through his still wet hair. He wasn't used to being ignored. In his life, people trembled just hearing his name. Powerful executives stammered in his presence, but here he was, being completely ignored by a street kid. When they arrived at the mansion, Draven instructed his housekeeper, Mrs. Rodriguez, to take care of the girl. The woman, who had worked for him for over a decade, seemed momentarily shocked by the situation, but quickly recovered. "I'll draw her a warm bath and find some clothes," she said, reaching out to Lily. The girl didn't move. "She's blind, Mrs. Rodriguez," Draven explained, his voice betraying a note of concern that even he found strange. "She'll need help." The housekeeper nodded, now approaching more carefully. "Come on, honey. I'll help you get cleaned up and warm." To Draven's surprise, Lily allowed Mrs. Rodriguez to guide her. Maybe it was something in the housekeeper's gentle voice, so different from his own gruff way of speaking. While the girl was being taken care of, Draven went to his study, still wearing his wet clothes. He sat in his leather chair, looking out the panoramic window that offered a privileged view of the city. The same city that just hours ago had almost swallowed a child without anyone caring. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. Important meetings, pending contracts, decisions that couldn't wait. His life of success and power demanded constant attention. But for the first time in years, Draven ignored all the calls. An hour later, Mrs. Rodriguez returned to the study. "The girl is clean and warm, Mr. Sterling. I managed to get her to eat some soup, but she doesn't talk, Mr. Sterling. Not a word." And the housekeeper hesitated. "Tell me, Mrs. Rodriguez, there are marks on her body, old ones, the kind of marks no child should have." Draven felt his jaw clench. He knew those kinds of marks well. His own body carried some, reminders of a childhood he preferred to forget. "Prepare the guest room," he ordered. "She'll stay here tonight." "Just tonight, Mr. Sterling?" The question hung in the air like a silent accusation. Draven didn't answer. He didn't know the answer himself. During the night, unable to sleep, he found himself walking through the silent hallways of his mansion. He stopped in front of the room where Lily was staying, listening through the door. No sound. Had she run away? He opened the door slowly, only to find the girl sitting on the king-size bed, looking even smaller amidst the silk sheets. She was awake, her head turned towards the window, as if she could see the moon shining outside. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. "Why did you save me?" The question came as a whisper, the first thing she had said since the incident. The question caught him off guard. Why, indeed? He had no answer. "You should have let me sink," she continued, her small voice carrying a weight that no child should know. "It would have been easier." Something inside Draven snapped when he heard those words. The resignation in her voice was too familiar, echoing memories he had buried deep in his past. "Nothing in life is easy," he replied, sitting on the edge of the bed. "But that doesn't mean we should give up." "You don't understand," Lily said, turning her face away from him. "Some people weren't born to have a place in the world." "Who told you that?" "No one needed to tell me. I learned it myself." The silence that followed was deafening. Draven wanted to say something, offer some kind of comfort, but the words seemed inadequate. He, who was used to commanding rooms, full of executives with his eloquence, found himself speechless before a child. The next morning, Draven cancelled all his appointments, something he had never done before. He spent the day making discreet calls, trying to find out more about the girl he had rescued. But it was as if Lily didn't officially exist. No records, no trace of her origin. Mrs. Rodriguez reported that the girl had spent the day exploring the room with her hands, memorizing every detail, every texture. She refused to leave the room, as if she feared getting lost in the vast space of the mansion. At night, as Draven was about to turn in, a soft sound reached his ears. A melody, almost a whisper, was coming from Lily's room. He approached the door silently, and his heart nearly stopped when he recognized the song. It was an old lullaby, a melody he hadn't heard in decades, a song that only one person had sung to him long ago, when he was still a scared boy, living in the shadows of a family that never truly accepted him. The melody haunted Draven throughout the night, unearthing memories he had fought to keep buried. In his luxurious bedroom, the walls that bore witness to his success seemed to suffocate him. He closed his eyes, but the music kept echoing in his mind, bringing back the face of Helen, the only person who had ever shown him true affection. Helen had been a housekeeper at the Blackwood Mansion, the family that controlled one of the largest business empires in the country. Draven grew up in the back of that house, the bastard son of the patriarch, a secret that everyone knew but no one dared to mention. His mother, one of the maids, died in childbirth, leaving him completely alone in the world. Every night, when the other employees had already retired, Helen would go to his room in the back of the mansion. She would sit next to his bed and sing that same lullaby that he now heard Lily murmuring. It was the only moment of the day when Draven allowed himself to be just a child, and not the unwanted son that everyone despised. But then, one ordinary morning, Helen disappeared. No one could explain where she went or why. Some said she had been fired, others whispered about a possible scandal. For Draven, all that remained was the silence of the nights and the certainty that once again he had been abandoned. The coincidence was too disturbing to ignore. How could Lily know that specific song? A song he had never heard again in his entire adult life? In the morning, Draven found Mrs. Rodriguez preparing breakfast. The housekeeper looked worried. "The girl didn't sleep well, Mr. Sterling," she informed him, nervously fidgeting with her apron. "She spent the whole night singing the same song, as if she were in a trance." "Where did she learn that song?" Draven asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "I don't know, Mr. Sterling. She doesn't answer when I ask. In fact, she barely speaks. She just sings." Draven went upstairs towards Lily's room, his heavy steps echoing through the empty mansion. He found the girl sitting in the same place, as always near the window, her small fingers tracing invisible patterns on the glass. "Who taught you that song?" he asked bluntly. Lily turned her face towards him, her unfocused eyes seeming to see through him. "She sang it to me every night," she replied in a distant voice, "before she left." "Who's she?" "I don't know her name. I don't remember her face, just her voice and the song." Draven's heart raced. Could it be? No, it was too absurd. He needed concrete answers, not theories based on coincidences. That same afternoon, Draven summoned his team of private investigators, discreet, efficient men who had been handling the most delicate matters of his business for years. He ordered them to investigate everything about Helen, her whereabouts after leaving the Blackwood mansion, any detail that could connect her to Lily. While he waited for the information, Draven found himself increasingly drawn to the girl. He watched from afar as she cautiously explored new corners of the mansion, always with her hands outstretched, mapping her way. Mrs. Rodriguez had become her constant guide, teaching her to orient herself by the different sounds and textures of the house. One morning, as he passed by the sunroom, Draven heard something that made him stop. Laughter. The sound was so rare in his house that for a moment he thought he was imagining it. But there was Lily, sitting on the floor with Mrs. Rodriguez, her small hands dipped in a bowl of water. "See? This is how you make bubbles," the housekeeper explained patiently. "Now blow very slowly." Lily blew, and although she couldn't see the bubbles floating around her, her face lit up at the sound they made when they popped. Draven stood still, watching the scene. Something in his chest tightened as he realized that this was probably the first time he had seen Lily acting like a real kid. The moment was interrupted by the arrival of his assistant, Marcus, with a folder of urgent documents. Draven reluctantly retreated to his study, where hours of video conference calls awaited him. In the late afternoon, when he finally managed to steal a moment of peace, he found an envelope on his desk. The preliminary report from the investigation into Helen. With slightly trembling hands, he opened the envelope and began to read. The information was scarce, but enough to make his blood run cold. Helen had left the Blackwood mansion pregnant, a baby that no one knew existed. The dates coincided perfectly with Lily's appearance on the streets of the city. But there was more. A car accident 7 years ago. Helen was on the list of fatalities. The police report mentioned that she was traveling with a child, but the girl's body was never found. Draven let the papers fall onto the desk, his mind a storm of possibilities and revelations. Helen had left not by choice, but to protect her daughter, a daughter who, for some reason, needed to be kept secret. The sound of breaking glass jolted him from his thoughts. He ran to the sunroom where he found Lily huddled in a corner, shards of a vase scattered around her. Mrs. Rodriguez was trying to calm her down, but the girl was trembling violently. "He's here," Lily whispered repeatedly, her face pale with fear. "He found me." "Who's here?" Draven asked, approaching cautiously. "The man from the ship. He's watching, always watching." Draven rushed to the window, scanning the mansion grounds with watchful eyes. For a moment, he thought he saw a shadow moving among the trees, but when he blinked, there was nothing there. That night, Draven reinforced the security of the mansion. Additional cameras were installed, extra guards were positioned in strategic locations. But even so, he couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Lily refused to sleep in her room. Mrs. Rodriguez found her huddled in a linen closet, clutching a piece of fabric that smelled of fabric softener. "It's safe here," she murmured. "The smell is different. He won't find me here." Draven watched helplessly as the housekeeper tried to convince the girl to come out of hiding. For the first time in his life, all his power and money seemed useless in the face of a child's terror. It was then that he noticed something strange, a small card that had fallen out of the pocket of Lily's dress. Upon picking it up, his heart nearly stopped. It was an old Blackwood business card, yellowed with age, with a handwritten message on the back. "Protect her! They must never know!" The handwriting was Helen's. The business card trembled in Draven's hands as he paced back and forth in his study. Helen's message, those few words written with urgency, carried a weight he could barely bear. Protect Lily. But from whom? And why? The answer began to form in his mind like pieces of a macabre puzzle. The Blackwoods, the family that had marginalized him throughout his childhood, were known for their obsession with lineage and appearances. An empire built on generations of arranged marriages and carefully calculated alliances. And Helen had been more than just a housekeeper. She knew all the family secrets, all the shadows that hid behind the Blackwoods' facade of perfection, including the secret of his own existence as a bastard son. The study door opened softly, and Mrs. Rodriguez entered with a cup of tea. Her normally serene face was etched with worry. "Were you able to get Lily to sleep?" Draven asked, quickly putting the card in his pocket. "Yes, Mr. Sterling, but..." She hesitated, wringing her hands in her apron. "There's something I need to tell you about the girl." Draven gestured for her to continue. "While I was helping her get ready for bed, I noticed something. A birthmark, very small, behind her right ear. It looks like a little star." The world seemed to stop for a moment. Draven instinctively reached for his own right ear, where he carried an identical mark. A characteristic he had always considered unique, one of the few things he had inherited from his biological father. "Are you sure?" His voice was hoarse, almost unrecognizable. "Absolutely, Mr. Sterling. And there's more. When I was putting away her clothes earlier, I found this." The housekeeper held out a small silver locket so old that you could barely distinguish the engraved design, but Draven recognized it immediately. It was identical to the one Helen had given him on his 10th birthday, the only gift he had ever received in his childhood. "She said she always had it with her," Mrs. Rodriguez continued, "that it was the only thing left of her mother." Draven's hands trembled as he held the locket. Long-buried memories began to emerge. Helen used to wear one just like it. She said it was a family heirloom, passed down from mother to child. And now, here was another identical one in the hands of a blind girl who sang the same lullaby. The phone rang, making them both jump. It was Marcus, his private investigator. "Mr. Sterling," his voice was tense. "We found something about Helen. After she left the Blackwood mansion, she spent a few months hiding in a small town upstate. She was pregnant." Draven felt the air leave his lungs. "Go on." "The baby was born in January, a girl, but something happened. Helen fled again, this time taking the child. Records show she was being followed. Someone from the Blackwoods was hunting her." "Why?" Draven barely recognized his own voice. "We don't know for sure yet, but..." Marcus hesitated. "We found old documents, correspondence between Helen and your biological father, Mr. Sterling. It seems she discovered something, a secret that could destroy the Blackwoods, something related to the true inheritance of the family." The weight of that revelation fell on Draven like an avalanche. Helen hadn't simply run away. She was protecting not only her daughter, but also a secret that cost her life. A scream from upstairs interrupted his thoughts. It was Lily. Draven ran up the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. He found the girl sitting on the bed, trembling violently. "They're coming," she whispered, her face pale with terror. "I can feel it, like that night, the same smell, the same sound." "What night, Lily?" Draven asked gently, sitting next to her. "The night of the accident, when she told me to run, said no matter what happened, I couldn't let them catch me." Draven felt his blood run cold. "You remember the accident?" "The car. There was another car following us. She was scared. She sang to me that song, said it was special, that it was our secret song. Then," Lily swallowed hard, "then there were the lights, the noise, and then just darkness." Mrs. Rodriguez, standing in the doorway, stifled a sob. "After that," Lily continued, her voice just a whisper, "I couldn't see anymore. The doctors said it was the trauma, but she wasn't there anymore when I woke up. I ran away from the hospital before they came back, the men who were following us." Draven hugged her instinctively, feeling her small body tremble. She was his sister. There was no more doubt. Helen had died trying to protect not only a secret, but also her daughter, the sister he never knew he had. The sound of breaking glass downstairs made them freeze. Heavy footsteps echoed through the hallway. Someone had broken into the mansion. "They found me," Lily whispered, clinging to Draven tightly. "Like that night at the docks, they always find me." The footsteps continued echoing through the mansion, getting closer and closer. Draven acted quickly, scooping Lily into his arms and signaling Mrs. Rodriguez to remain silent. Years of managing his businesses had taught him to always have an escape plan, and now that precaution proved vital. In his study, there was a discreet passage that led to a small safe room installed when he renovated the mansion. It was his last resort, a place that very few people knew about. Carrying Lily, he moved silently through the dark hallways, mindful of every step. "Mr. Sterling," Mrs. Rodriguez whispered, following them closely. "The security guards have been neutralized," Draven finished in a low voice. "They wouldn't have gotten in if the security was still active." Lily remained perfectly still in his arms, but he could feel her heart racing. Her small fingers clutched his shirt tightly, as if she feared she might be torn away from him at any moment. Reaching the study, Draven locked the door silently. As he walked towards the bookcase that concealed the secret passage, an envelope on his desk caught his eye. It wasn't there when he left to check on Lily. Inside the envelope was an old photo, Helen holding a baby. On the back, a handwritten message that made his blood run cold. She should never have survived the accident. Finish the job, or the entire Blackwood family will fall. The photo trembled in his hands. Helen's eyes in the picture seemed to look directly at him, begging for protection for her daughter. The same protection he couldn't give her. A noise in the hallway made them freeze. Draven gently placed Lily on the floor and activated the mechanism that opened the secret passage. The bookcase slid silently, revealing a small metal door. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Draven whispered, "take Lily inside. There's a phone in there. Speed dial number 1. It's a secure line directly to Marcus. Tell him to initiate Phoenix Protocol." "No!" Lily grabbed his hand with surprising strength. "Don't leave me, please. She also said she'd come back." Draven knelt before her, holding her small hands. "Lily, listen to me. Helen, your mother, she was my sister. That makes you my niece, family, and I promise I won't let anything happen to you. But I need you to be brave now." How do you know she was your sister?" "The song you sing, the locket you wear. Helen gave an identical one to me when I was a child. She protected us all these years, leaving clues for us to find each other, and now it's my turn to protect you." Silent tears streamed down Lily's face. Her fingers touched the locket on her neck, then reached for Draven's, confirming that they were identical. The study door rattled with violent blows. There was no more time. "Mrs. Rodriguez, now!" Draven ordered, practically pushing them both into the secret passage. As soon as the bookcase slid back into place, the study door was forced open. 3 men entered, led by a figure Draven knew well, Charles Blackwood, CEO of the corporation. "Where's the girl, Draven?" Charles asked with false cordiality. "What girl? Don't play dumb," Charles advanced, throwing another envelope onto the desk. "We have proof that Helen survived long enough after the accident to hide something that could destroy our family, and that little freak is the key." "Helen." Draven kept his voice calm, buying time. "The housekeeper you murdered." "Housekeeper," Charles laughed humorlessly. "Helen was much more than that. She was the bastard daughter of Old Man Blackwood, just like you, and that girl, well, let's just say she carries a valuable secret in her blood." Draven's heart raced with the confirmation. Helen was indeed his sister. And now he understood why she had fled pregnant, why she had been so afraid. "The original will," Charles continued, "Helen found it before she fled. A document that divides the inheritance equally among all of Blackwood's children, legitimate or not. With her dead, you'd be the only problem. But now, with the girl alive..." "So that's it?" Draven interrupted, disgust in his voice. "All this, terror, Helen's death, years chasing an innocent child, all for money, for power," Charles corrected. "The Blackwoods built an empire. I won't let it be destroyed by bastards." At that moment, sirens began to wail in the distance, rapidly approaching the mansion. Charles rushed to the window, his face paling as he saw the police cars entering. Through the gates. "What did you do?" "Me?" Draven smiled, even as Charles grabbed him by the collar of his shirt. "Nothing. But did you know my entire study is equipped with state-of-the-art cameras and microphones? The confession about Helen's murder should be especially interesting to the police." Charles's face contorted in absolute fury. He raised his fist, ready to strike, but stopped as he heard a familiar voice coming from the hidden speakers. "Too late, Charles." The voice of Marcus, Draven's investigator, echoed through the room. "The confession has already been broadcast live to the police. It's over." The sound of footsteps and authoritative voices filled the hallways of the mansion. Charles and his men were quickly subdued and handcuffed, while Draven watched in silence. When it was all over, he reopened the secret passage. Lily ran into his arms immediately, trembling but safe. Mrs. Rodriguez watched them with tears in her eyes. "Is it really over?" Lily asked in a whisper. "Yes, honey," Draven replied, hugging her tightly. "Now we're a real family, and no one will ever change that." The months that followed were a roller coaster of emotions. The Blackwood case dominated the headlines, a story of greed, betrayal, and family secrets that shocked society. Charles and his cronies were arrested, and the Blackwood Empire began to crumble under the weight of its own lies. But for Draven, these issues were secondary. His priority now was Lily and the difficult task of building a relationship with the sister he never knew he had. The girl, although still reserved, was slowly beginning to open up, like a flower finally, finding the light after years in the darkness. Mrs. Rodriguez remained a constant presence, now more like part of the family than an employee. She watched with maternal eyes as Draven learned to be a brother, a father, and a protector all at the same time. "I can't sleep," Lily confessed one night, her small voice piercing the silence of the mansion. "I'm afraid I'll wake up and find that all of this was just a dream." Draven, who spent more and more nights in an armchair next to her bed, held her delicate hand. "It's not a dream, honey. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Over time, the once cold and silent mansion began to come alive. Draven hired the best specialists in education for blind children, determined to give Lily every opportunity she deserved. The library gained an entire section of Braille books, and the garden was adapted with aromatic plants that she could recognize by touch and smell. But the biggest transformation wasn't physical, it was emotional. Draven, the man who had built his life on cold, calculated decisions, was learning daily about unconditional love. Every small progress of Lily was celebrated as a personal victory. "You know," she said one afternoon, while exploring the sensory garden he had built, "Mom always said that one day we'd find our real family." Draven, who watched her play with the flowers, felt his heart tighten. She was right, as always. "She talked about you," Lily continued, her fingers gently caressing the petals of a rose. "Not by name, but she talked about the brave boy who had to grow up alone. She said that one day we'd find each other, and then we wouldn't be alone anymore." Silent tears streamed down Draven's face. Helen, even after everything she had suffered, had never lost hope. She had paved the way for her children to find each other, leaving clues in the identical lockets, in the lullaby they both knew. One day, while organizing some old documents, Draven found a diary of Helen's. The yellowed pages contained not only her secrets, but also her love and her hopes. In the last entry, written just days before the accident, she had written, "My beloved, children, if you ever read this, know that true love never dies. It just finds new ways to blossom." The doctors had said that Lily's blindness was psychological, a result of the trauma of the accident. With therapy and time, there was a possibility of recovery. But for Draven, that didn't matter. His sister was perfect exactly as she was. "Do you think she'd be happy?" Lily asked one night after Draven finished singing the old lullaby. "Mom, do you think she'd be happy to see us together?" "I'm sure she is," he replied, tucking the blanket around her. "In fact, I think she always knew this would happen." Weeks turned into months, and months into years. The mansion, once a monument to Draven's loneliness, became a true home. Lily's laughter echoed through the halls, mingling with the sound of the piano she had learned to play with extraordinary sensitivity. Draven's business empire continued to prosper, but now with a different purpose. He established a foundation in Helen's name, dedicated to helping abandoned and disabled children. The money that was once just a means of proving his worth became a tool for doing good. One especially bright morning, 5 years after the day he jumped into the sea to save an unknown girl, Draven was in his study when he heard something that made his heart stop. Lily, now 12 years old, was in the garden and had called out his name with a different urgency. He ran there, fearing the worst, only to find her standing in the middle of the flowers, tears streaming down her face. But there was something different in her gaze, a sparkle he had never seen before. "Draven," she whispered, her hands trembling as she pointed to a rose. "I can see. It's not very clear, but I can see the colors, the red of the rose, the blue of the sky." He embraced her, both crying now. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had run over upon hearing the commotion, watched the scene with tears in her eyes. "Mom was right," Lily murmured against his chest. "She always said that one day the darkness would pass, that when we found our real family, the light would return." That night, as Lily slept, Draven stood in his usual place beside her bed. On the bedside table, the two identical lockets shimmered under the soft light of the lamp. He picked up the old Blackwood business card, the one with Helen's message. "Protect her. They must never know." He smiled, turning the card between his fingers. Helen had achieved what she wanted. She had not only protected her daughter, but had ensured that she found her way to the brother she never knew she had. In her wisdom, she had planted the seeds of a true family. Outside the mansion, the garden that Lily loved so much flourished. Under the moonlight, The roses that she could now see spread their fragrance through the night, like a promise that sometimes happy endings aren't just dreams. Sometimes they are born from the most improbable stories, from the deepest love, from the hope that never dies. And somewhere Draven was sure Helen smiled.